this is a granary that was built by my grandfather, Fred Hathaway, and my dad, Ralph Hathaway. And Grandpa was building the granary, started it at some point, I think, during World War II, when my dad was overseas, and then when my dad came back from the war, they worked on it together. And the idea was to make a consolidated storage area for grain. Before this time, there were separate little bins for each different kind of grain, and it was hard to get the grain in and hard to get the grain out. Most of that was just done by shoveling, by just scooping the crop. They also had different grain bins for different people because they farmed the ground that belonged to Uncle Henry. He had his own corn crib and his own grain bins because they didn't have a way of weighing the grain to measure the amount. They just kept them separate. And some of the grain was kept here on the farm because they needed it to feed chickens or feed hogs or feed cattle or whatever. Some of it was stored so that later on, when times weren't so busy, like during harvest, that it could be sold. Some other people just hauled all their grain to the elevator, and then you had to pay storage on it. By having home storage, it saved a little bit of money and kept it under their control. So the grain storage is basically in two different parts. On the south side are these wooden grain bins, and where the doors are, there were slotted boards that would fit in there. And this wood is shiplap, where one board would fit down over another one. It's a different kind of siding. So this would fit in here. This obviously isn't the board for this opening. So that as the grain filled up, you could add boards. And then as you took the grain out, you could lower boards. At the end, you still had to go in and do a little bit of scooping, but not a lot. There was an opening in the floor that the grain would go out of. You can see a bar in there to reinforce it, to help keep it sturdy. Then this part over here was where the engine, and it was like an engine room or motor room for the electrical equipment that would run the elevator. And sometimes other stuff was stored here. And then this is more of those wooden grain bins. There's small ones for oats or crops that they didn't have so much of, and then the large ones for wheat. The problem with storing these grains in wooden bins is that weevil and other grain insects would then burrow into the wood and damage the wood. So it was a big advantage to have steel bins. So Grandpa was able to get some steel bins, and 3 of them were incorporated on this side of the elevator. The part where we're standing now is the drive-through. So this is where the truck, or later the trailer, would drive in and dump the load of grain. And then a system, and I'll show those more in a minute, but a system of wooden troughs and augers move the grain from this area over up to these two sections here. These were called the legs of the elevator, and they had a pulley belt with metal cups on it, and they would just come down and pick up the grain and take it up and dump it out. And where it dumped out, there was a collector and then a spout that would be directed to whichever one of these grain bins that grain was going to. Okay, this is the door where the first auger was. So below this door is a sloping tin arrangement that goes down to the opening of the auger. And the auger carries the grain over here to the base of this leg. And then the grain goes up, gets dumped out, the empty one comes down, it comes back over. So it's a continuous belt with the cups on it. These floors all lift up so people can get down there to work if there's some kind of problem. So then when it gets up in the top part, that is where the grain is dispersed to the various bins. Some of these features, like this ladder, was added much later. So these are those same legs that we saw down below. And up above here, you can see all these spouts coming out. And they're attached to sections from a wheel that was ruined, but that just gave a structure to fasten those to. And so there'd be a system of levers that you could close off one of these spouts or open a spout, and then the spouts continued over to the top of those grain bins that were downstairs. And so, yeah, so you could turn to whichever spout you wanted to use and then start the grain up here. And so the grain would come up into the head house, which is that little cupola that's on the top, and then the grain would come down and slide down these spouts to the correct bin. When you're ready to sell the grain, there was a door in the bottom of the grain bin that could be opened by pulling out a lever that would pull it. You didn't just leave it open or it would get packed with grain. And you'd open that, and then the grain would travel in a trough over to where it could be picked up by these same pulleys, and it would bring it up and then drop it down into the top of the pickup, or the truck, the bed of the truck where the grain was hauled out. Later, when my dad got a gooseneck, it was too big. The gooseneck trailer was too big to go in here, so then he had a different spout that was outside. But he still used all of this apparatus. The danger of the whole thing is that if you let the wheat out of the truck too fast, then things get clogged up. And once that auger is clogged up, then it tries to turn, but it can't turn because the wheat can't go anywhere because it's clogged up ahead of it. And all that has to be dug out by hand and cleaned out. And it's really difficult. If it was a year with high humidity where the wheat was a little bit damp, or maybe the wheat test dry but the air is damp, then the wheat would clog up more quickly. And these are all things that a commercial elevator has to deal with too. It's just when you're having to do it yourself, it's on a smaller scale, and yet it's more important when all these problems happen. I was the truck driver from when I learned to drive, when I was a freshman in high school. So it was my job to drive the pickup to the field, and my dad was in the field with the combine, and when the combine bin got full, he would use that system of augers to dump the wheat into the pickup. Then I would drive it back here, park it in that little area between the wooden bins and the steel bins, and then I would measure how deep it was, how deep the bed was, and from that figure out how many bushels of wheat it was, because that was the only way we counted it. My dad knew how the truck would hold 56 bushels. The combine bin would hold 56 bushels, so if it was clear full, we knew it was 56. If it wasn't that full, he would estimate. And all that would be written down and recorded later. We also had to keep track of what field it was from, if it was Daddy's ground or rented ground or Grandpa's ground or whoever's ground it was. But you would generally cut a whole field at one time, so one full day's cutting would generally be to that one landowner or that one piece of property. Then I would, after I wrote it down, then I would slowly raise the bed and let that wheat start out when I opened the end gate of the pickup. If I had the end gate of the pickup open too much, then that pit that the grain fell into would get full. So I'd have to kind of gauge between those and watch it. It isn't like you could just open it up and then just, stand around and daydream. You had to just kind of watch it. And then when the wheat slowed down, then I'd have to raise the bed more. I couldn't raise the bed clear up or it would hit the top. And the pickup we had, and still have, Joseph has it now, is a 1937 GMC pickup with a 1932 Chevy bed on it, and my dad put on a lift. So it was one of the few antique trucks around with antique tag on the back that was still being used in harvest that also had a lift. When all the wheat that would come out, then you'd have to take a scoop and scoop out the corners and get it cleaned up. You didn't actually go in and have to sweep it because you're just going to put more wheat in it. And then you'd close the gate and undo all the things to turn the motor off and then head back to the field. So theoretically, I could dump a load of wheat in about the same time it took my dad to cut a load of wheat. So I would be back at the field when he was ready. Sometimes if things were going slow, we'd have an extra truck there. We had a bigger truck. I think it was a 1952 or 55 International truck. And it was bigger, and it was really hard to get it in here to dump. So mostly we just used the little one, and mostly I could keep up because all our ground was nearby. There were a few years when the elevator was full, or for some reason we had to haul the wheat to town. And then sometimes Daddy would just have to shut down the combine because his bin was full, all the vehicles were full, and he was still waiting for us to get back. So it was a big benefit to have home storage. And this is old and derelict because nobody's used it for years, but it's hard to imagine how neat and how really, really, really efficient it was to use, and very well designed and planned so that we were able to use it for so many generations.
So how many bushels could the metal bins hold?
There, it's written on and down below, and it varies because, these were meant to be outside where they had a top on them so you could fill the top on up. And so they're not all the same size, and whatever the diameter is determines the size. But if we go downstairs, we can look on that and see how these are numbered so that Daddy knew which one went to which one.
So how old is this granary?
Well, it was during World War II that I think the two of them had talked about it, and then after Pearl Harbor was bombed, Daddy enlisted and left. So then Grandpa started it during that time. Daddy was an only child, and the war was very, very difficult for Grandpa. It was really hard on him because his only child is over there somewhere, and who knows what's happening. And he was a little bit bitter that his brother and very, very close friend had 3 sons, none of whom were even overseas. They weren't involved in the army at all, and it just was a constant worry to him. And I think building this granary that they had planned together, that they would be using together when my dad returned, was kind of a therapy for Grandpa. It gave him something to keep him busy. He was so proud of the work, and it was his way of fighting the war, because grain was very important because there were so many things in short supply, and getting things shipped around was a problem because so many people were involved in the war effort, so that farmers were very much appreciated for their contribution to the war, and that's how he took it. This was his way of fighting the war. This is bin number 2, and it holds 1,000 bushels. The bins, there's a little hole in the floor that's covered by a door, and this board would fit on there and close that up. So when you put the wheat in, the wheat was going to stay in. But then when you were ready to sell the wheat, you would come out here and pull this out so that that opening was open so that the wheat could follow down through that. And then there's a tube that takes it over to the pit. And then it goes down the pit and up the leg and dumps on top. But then instead of going into another bin, it comes out the spout that's stationed here on top, falls down into the truck. So then once the truck is full, Then you close this first, so the wheat stops coming out. And then when the pit is empty, and that the leg, he can hear that there's not wheat still coming down in it, then you can turn that off. You had to do it in that order. If you shut it down from the wrong end, then everything would be filled with wheat that would have to be dug out by hand before you could start it up again.